Good morning and welcome to my YouTube channel, everybody. For this week's video, I'm going to go through another layout design. In this case, it is for a site which really was not conducive to housing a model railroad. Let me take a look at it. Here is the sketch the customer sent me. Now, overall, the site is approximately 18 feet by 11.5. But it does have some very awkward obstructions, including a forest of support columns, some of them in very unfortunate locations. Now the stairs come down this wall here, meaning that we can't expand the benchwork any further in this direction. And also there is steps across the middle of the room, meaning we can't even get a level aisle to walk on. And this was a good example of a customer who, although he started out with very unrealistic expectations of what we'd be able to fit in the space he had available, he quickly came round and accepted what would fit while letting go of what wouldn't. And I have to commend him for that. Now, to make matters worse, he had also already built the benchwork in the room. Let's take a look at it. Here are some photographs that he sent me. We see benchwork already built, very low down, too low actually, and too wide to reach across to the back of the benchwork here. Here's the other half of the room, and we can see here how obtrusive the support columns are going to be. Here's the whole site. You can see the stairs coming down at the end. And at first he was hoping that I would be able to keep the same benchwork, and asked me if I could design a layout around what he already had. I'll get back to that in a minute, but let's first take a look at what the customer wanted to fit in the way of a layout. He wanted to be able to run a big boy locomotive and passenger trains. He wanted a coal mine, a steel mill, a dock or port, a roundhouse, engine house, freight yard, numerous small industries, a steel mill, a limestone quarry, small rural towns, and small industries along the route. He also was not open to a double deck layout. It had to be a single deck layout. At first he said no to subterranean staging, but I managed to convince him that it would improve the layout greatly if he would let me put some in. And although he wanted to run a big boy and passenger trains, he was at first under the impression that he'd be able to get away with curves in the 15 to 24 inch radius. Now, when it comes to layout designs, it seems that a large part of my job is educating customers on what is feasible and what isn't. And of course, with large articulated steam locomotives and full-length passenger cars, we really need 30 inches as an absolute minimum. As I said, at first he asked me if I could possibly use the existing benchwork. So here is his existing benchwork with a rough idea for a layout superimposed on it, showing a twice round oval with a staging area, a minimal yard, one intermediate town, and a small port in this small area labelled D. This would need to be a moving section here to allow access. Now, with the shape of the benchwork, it wasn't quite possible to get a 30-inch radius curve around here. This post was just too close to the wall, and coming around the other side of it wasn't going to work because the stairs need this area open. So using the existing benchwork, there was not quite room to put an acceptable radius curve in this area. So the only way to do it was to have his continuous run looping around the room with some kind of a lift out section here. Now, it's quickly apparent that this was not going to satisfy him, so we moved on, and he accepted the fact that the existing benchwork wasn't going to work for his layout. At that point, he also gave me a little bit more real estate to work with. He decided that there was room to expand the benchwork around here. Initially, he just mentioned these two sides here, but then there was a step on the floor here, and adding an extra 12 inches of benchwork here would cover that step and therefore get rid of one potential fall risk. Also, increasing the length of this benchwork by a foot can only be beneficial. Of course, now there are two more columns in the space. This one here I already had the location of. This one is highlighted in green because I didn't know exactly where it was. I had to guess it from the photograph. so I highlighted it to remind me to ask him for accurate dimensions. So with this new site available, this is what I drew. We see how changing the shape of the benchwork here slightly, we're now able to get a 30-inch radius curve between these two columns. And then we can wrap around the peninsula and get actually a reasonable length run. Now at this point, I asked him about this room here, labelled Area C. I was hoping that we could perhaps extend into this area. It turned out that it's his utility room, and it was not going to be available for a layout expansion. Although we did talk about the possibility of just a small staging shelf in here for some offstage industries. Now, because of the different levels on the floor, this aisle around the outside along this side is almost 2 feet higher up than the aisle through the middle of the layout. And this led me to think about the possibility of running around twice and putting a high level area over the top around this side of the layout. Because at this stage it was obvious that he wasn't going to have room for a decent staging yard without significantly cutting into what he was going to be able to have on the visible portion of the layout. So here I drew a twice round plan based on the previous one. Now it looks like a very high track density at the moment because all the track is shown. Ultimately a fair bit of it would have to be in tunnels to make the scenery work, and that would reduce the visible track density and also the spaghetti ball effect. We see here we've got the harbour in the corner, we've got his quarry and his mine, one small intermediate town with a single industrial spur. This area here is going to be for his yard, with as much of a steel mill as possible built as background flats along the double-sided backdrop, with the lower loop passing underneath the main yard for a staging area. If we recall, the aisleway along this side is significantly higher up than it is around the middle, so the fact that we are now at the highest elevation for our main yard and switching area really works quite well with the raised walkway. And by keeping the grades to a little over 2%, I was able to get a 13-inch vertical separation between the two decks at this point. And allowing for 4 inches of benchwork gives 9 inches of airspace over the staging yard. Here's the lower level. It shows 6 double-ended staging tracks through here. Most of them are fairly long, and then the junction for the harbour branch. I would like to have had this junction on the visible portion of the layout, but it just wasn't going to work. The only way I could possibly tie it in at an acceptable elevation was to hook it up off the staging yard. Here is the same plan with the main yard area fleshed out a little more. We see here how I'm attempting to use a small area of the furnace room to add a shelf to represent other parts of the steel mill. I was thinking this could represent an offstage coke plant and byproducts area. Now, modelling a single blast furnace is not ideal. Most steel mills would have several of them, but there was barely room for one, never mind more than one. And then the rest of the area, I've just squeezed in as much as I can in the way of steel mill buildings. I've shown the electric furnace, a single rolling mill, and part of a strip mill. This column here is obscured by a blower house, which, as per the Ford's Rouge River plant, has a track running through the corner of it. And the other post is in the electric furnace. Both of these structures are fairly tall, slab-sided buildings and are therefore ideal for obscuring the base of support columns. The 4 columns in the mountainous portion of the layout will just have to be hidden as best we can in rock outcrops or in dense clumps of trees. We're thinking that by building up the scenery as high as possible around them, putting dense tree coverage and painting the column a neutral colour will hopefully make them relatively inobtrusive. Now, because he had earlier said that he might want to run passenger trains, I put this loop track in here with a passenger station in this corner. This structure here is the size of the large Walters passenger station. Not the Union Station, but the one I think they call it a city passenger station. It's the one that's on my layout. He eventually asked me to remove that. He wanted to make that space available for industries, and then put small passenger stations in the other portion of the layout. I'll show you those on a later plan. We put one here and one over there. We do have a rather narrow throat here at only 24 inches. Eventually I realigned the track slightly here and was able to get 25 inches. But the customer is expecting to be a solo operator most of the time. And if he does have visitors, at least it's only a short chicane area and there's a nice broad area beyond it. So for the occasional visitors he's likely to have, there's still enough aisle space to avoid being clogged up. Now at this point there was some misunderstanding about the feasibility of this shelf here. I thought he had told me to go with it, and I drew this design where I actually made better use of it. I put 4 tracks in here representing the coke and byproducts plants, and also used the space in front of it for the power plant, because although there wasn't room for the entire building, it was possible to extend the feed track through the wall, using up the rest of the shelf, so that several cars can be delivered at once to the power plant. Of course, this wasn't going to work because I misinterpreted his instructions regarding this shelf in here. He asked me if I could use this corner here for a coke plant, and I had to give him the bad news that it wasn't going to be enough room. Here I have copied a small coke plant that I drew on someone else's layout, just to give an indication of how much space is required. All the basic elements here are drawn according to the Walters kit, which is a very small coke plant indeed. The gap between this track and the back of the coke ovens being for a very much compressed coke pusher. Although I did think it was possible to put in just the lead tracks to the area. So I did attempt to draw that in. Let me find that view. What I have here is the start of a small cold storage yard. There's room for about a dozen 2-bay hoppers in this area. And then 1 track leading to the coke plant, which is long enough to put 3 or 4 hoppers full of coke, which should be enough for 1 operating session to feed a single blast furnace. And then 2 tracks for tank cars feeding the byproducts plant. And since there is no longer a branch line cutting through this triangular space here to get to the furnace room, there is now room for a full-size power plant. Okay, here is an expansion of the staging yard, showing how there's room for a turntable and as many tracks for spare locomotives as he wants to include. Clearly there was no space on the visible portion of the layout for an engine terminal, but in staging it's a different matter, because we can get a lot more in a lot less space, since all we're having to do is park locomotives and not having to also service them in a realistic manner. Now here is the first version that I drew with most of the scenic features fleshed out. We can see how a lot of the track disappears into tunnels, making the layout look somewhat less cluttered. There is still a rather high density, especially in this area, but with careful use of tree lines, even more of the track can be obscured from view so that the extra tracks don't necessarily draw attention to themselves unless there are trains on them. And with only a single operator being normal for this railroad, more than likely there's only ever going to be a train on 1 track at a time. I also show how to obscure the columns, the dense clumpings of trees around them and tunnels where tracks have to go very close to them. Now of course, with dense clumps of trees around the columns, it's important to make sure that you have a reasonable amount of tree cover elsewhere. Otherwise, the dense clumpings will simply draw attention to the columns rather than disguise them. But this wasn't a problem, since one of the things he asked for was heavily wooded hills. And here we have the harbour in this corner. The backdrop here is a solid row of shallow building flats. And I've shown how it's possible for one of the warehouses to have an operating door and enough space inside to park a single car. Note that the track just goes through the curved backdrop into the corner. Also at about this time, we started discussing the possibility of expanding the benchwork in this corner. See, this green line adds about an extra 4 square feet of benchwork, because the walkway around here was a lot wider than it needed to be. Now there's a limit to how much we can put in here. We can't really go any further in this direction, otherwise this part of the benchwork behind the blast furnace gets too difficult to reach. Now originally my idea of using this was just to lengthen these 6 tracks in this area to give a greater capacity for the various cars that would be serving the coke plant. But I did some experimentation and a lot of manipulation, and eventually I found that I was just about able to fit in what had previously been impossible with the narrower benchwork. Let me find that view. Here we see this corner. All the structure sizes are the same as the ones I showed you before, but with everything twisted around the corner, and the building's flipped so that the coke pusher is on the front side instead of the back side, because the rails for the coke pusher can actually extend off the front of the railroad. It doesn't have to be able to run the whole length of the coke ovens. It only has to look as though it can. So this was something that the customer was very happy about. Here is the main deck of the finished plan with everything fleshed out. There have been several minor changes since the last one, some slight readjustments and reorganisation of the track layout. Now I certainly don't consider this plan to be ideal, but it's the best I could come up with in the space I was given based on the customer's desires. Certainly the yard and steel mill area is very cramped. I'm squeezing in about 10 gallons in a half-pint space. There is only a short yard lead at one end only. The other end I wasn't able to get a yard lead at all. Normally I would consider this lack of yard leads to be a serious problem, but at least in this case the layout is likely to be operated primarily with only a single person, so therefore there's only going to be a relatively low train density. It's not as though he's going to be constantly trying to dodge a parade of through trains from other operators. So rather than use up yard space unnecessarily, I decided to accept the short yard lead as probably the best compromise in the situation. And the order of the turnouts around this curve is not as I would like them either. I tried to squeeze in as much yard trackage as I could. If you recall, 1 extra track was added in this final version. And I've tried to keep the steel mill activities fairly balanced. I've got 1 blast furnace and an electric furnace, and then 2 mills at the back, 1 rolling mill and 1 strip mill. If the customer feels he needs extra capacity in the rolling mill, there is space to put an additional turnout in about here, and then have 2 tracks hidden in this building. Also in this final version, I made this spur here into an engine service track for the steel mill switcher. Now operationally, the customer has some choices. If you notice, the coal mine is very close to the steel mill, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to run the coal straight from the mine to the mill. It is possible to assume that this is not the best grade of coal for making coke, so this coal could go off stage, and then different coal could come in from the staging yard to feed the coke plant. And of course you have a choice of which direction you run the loads and the corresponding empties. Similarly with the quarry, you can choose whether to run the loads or empties the same way as the coal or the other way. And that choice might depend on whether or not he wants the stone blocks to be heading towards the harbour. Now before finishing, he did ask me to look at the possibility of expanding the staging yard. Here we see the previous version that I showed you with the 6 tracks and the engine storage facilities. Here I experimented with adding some stub-ended tracks, and I was just about able to get 1 track curving around inside the support column. Now if you recall, there's only about 9 inches of airspace over the staging tracks here. So although the double-sided backdrop is still shown drawn, it would have to be built higher up so that it does not protrude down below the scenery, because you'll need to be able to access the rear tracks from underneath it. So here's the first one I drew, and then I found other ways of getting successively more and more tracks in. By moving the junction to the harbour branch a few inches, I was able to move this turnout further up and get 3 tracks around inside this support column. And then one final adjustment, I changed the order of the turnouts in this area to give a slightly longer total usable track length. Now he might not build all the staging tracks, he might just put the front half in, but the space is there and I've showed him how he can utilise it if he wants to. I believe his plan is to just build the benchwork for it and then come back and add the extra tracks later if he finds he needs them. Well, I think that's about everything on this layout. I'll just leave the final drawing up one last time and I will say goodbye for this week. I hope you enjoyed this video. Hope you found something useful. Thanks for watching and I will see you again next time. Bye for now.